Matthew Waipoi and Ikuko will present the Indonesian middle class evolutionary impact. So we have approximately 45 minutes for the presentation, and then we have, let's say, another 45 minutes for the discussion on the floor. So, Matt, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Matt.
Good luck.
Thanks everyone for coming. This is certainly one of the more well-attended FKP events that I think we've seen in a while. So I think this topic is obviously of quite a bit of broad interest widely, and so I hope we can provide some interesting insights on it today. I must apologise, but I'm going to have to leave at 3, so we'll get through the presentation and initial discussion. A last-minute meeting has been called, and it couldn't happen at any other time. But we'll definitely get through the presentation and begin discussion, and then Ikuko, who's been working on the middle class as well, who will also present with me today, will stay for discussion, and Mattia and Ikuko will also guide that further. So what I'm going to do is there's a lot of material here, and there's even a lot more material sitting in the annex, which you have with you. I'm going to go through and sort of tell the main story here. In certain slides we may dwell on some of the analysis. Other slides I may go through relatively quickly and just sort of point out the storyline, but we can return to specific issues and slides in detail later if people want to. I also, if there are questions as I go through it on anything, I mean, discussion issues I would suggest keeping to the end, but questions of definition or analysis or data source or interpretation on that, feel free to stop me as we go. Okay, so the starting point of the report, what will be a report, comes out of the idea that there's been a lot of growing interest in the Indonesian middle class in recent years. So there's been a big report by McKinsey, a big report by BCG. There was an entire special issue on the middle class by Tempo, just to name a few examples. For all that there's been a lot of interest in it, there's been very little agreement on who the Indonesian middle class there is, how you would define it, and how many there are. So you have numbers ranging from 45 million from McKinsey, 74 million from BCG, 30 million from Nielsen, 81 million from the ADB. So a range of 30 to 81 million, which is pretty wide range. So one of the reasons for this is the middle class is a very loaded term. And so what we're looking to do in this presentation is to deconstruct it into the different roles that the middle class supposedly plays or can play in society. So some people, when they're talking about the middle class, are asking questions about economic and market influence. So how big is the consuming class? You know, where do they live? What contribution do they make to economic growth? Other people are thinking about socioeconomic behaviors. So, you know, socioeconomically speaking, who is secure? What sort of education do they have? Where do they work? What do they spend their money on? What are their attitudes and behaviors to things such as health and fitness, social issues, leisure and entertainment? Another group of people think about policy influence. And so they're thinking about which people are influencing policy making, or might be a voice to argue for cleaner governance, or might play a role in demanding greater quality of public service delivery. So in the West, traditionally all of these roles have been played by the middle class, or have been perceived to play by the middle class, which is why it's sort of a term that's used rather generically. So for example, if you look at the 50s to the 70s in the US, the middle class was seen to be this large and prosperous population who were helping drive the economic boom after the war. They were seen as being, white picket, being visibly defined by having a white picket fence, a car, 2 children, going on family vacations, and sending their kids to university, and so forth. And they were also seen as being behind the movements that led to a lot of policy progress in environment, civil rights, and social safety nets. And so because they sort of played these 3 roles, it's sort of thought of as the middle class as just being this homogenous group who have multiple functions in society. It's not necessarily the case that we might expect to see that here in Indonesia and other developing countries. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to go through each of these 3 functions and look to see who is playing each of these different functions in Indonesia, and are they the same people? So first, thinking about the economic dimensions. Firstly, how do we define consumption classes? And then how big is this market and how has it evolved over time? And what's been its role in economic growth? So that's the first thing we're looking at is the economic role of different classes. So thinking about definitions, there are many definitions used for the middle class or for consumer classes in these reports and in academic study as well. Some of these definitions are arbitrary. So $2 to $20, for example, is what the ADB uses. That's income or consumption per person per day, or $10 to $100 a day. And so these are absolute lines, but relatively arbitrary in terms of how they've been selected. Others are using a global benchmark. So they say, what's an average or a median of poverty lines around the world or in the developing world, or what's the poverty line in the US, or what's the median income in Brazil, and they've looked at different global benchmarks. A third group has used almost a behavioral definition of the middle class. So the middle class are those whose kids go to university education, and they own cars in their own house, and they go on family holidays and so forth. What we've chosen to use is a vulnerability definition. So we're thinking here of vulnerability as economic insecurity, and therefore the consumer class, we're thinking of those who are safe from falling back into poverty or vulnerability. So since we're thinking about the economic function of the middle class here, when we're looking at the consumer class, we're going to use an economic security definition. What do we think are the advantages of this? So it's conceptually grounded, right? It's not arbitrary like a $2 to $20 range or a $10 to $100 range. Secondly, when we've worked out what counts as economically secure, we've done it in the Indonesian context. So a lot of these global benchmarks are not necessarily relevant to Indonesia's stage of development or consumption distribution. Third, rather than ex ante define what the middle class do and look like, we've said let's look at the economically secure in Indonesia and empirically see, let the data explain what their behaviours and attitudes are. And fourthly, it can be held constant in conceptual terms over time. So what it means to be secure from poverty, or economically secure, which I'll show you very, very shortly, that concept can be estimated at different points in time. So how are we defining economic security? First of all, what we've done is we've taken the panel Susanas data from 2008 to 2010. So that's to say this National Socioeconomic Household Survey, they've revisited the same households for a number of, three times over 2 years. And what we've done is we've looked at people's consumption in the first year, and we've said what's the probability that they were going to be poor the next year. And so if we look at this first chart here, the first line here is the Indonesian poverty line. And this is in 2008, it's higher now. But that's the Indonesian poverty line, so everyone below that is poor. We've also looked then at your 2008 consumption and said, what's the probability that you'll be poor next year? And we've drawn this line here at 10%. So in other words, we're saying the vulnerability line is at a 10% chance of falling into poverty the following year. And the vulnerable are those who have a greater than 10% chance. Sorry. The second thing we've done is we've drawn the vulnerability curve, right? So the vulnerable are those that have less than a 10% chance of falling below the poverty line. We're now saying the consumer class, or the economically secure, are those that have a less than 10% chance of being vulnerable next year. And so that moves this line further up here. So the idea then is economically secure means there's a low probability that you'll be either poor or vulnerable next year. What does that mean in Indonesia? So we've got the poor, which are those households below the poverty line, which is around about, in 2013, that's about 270,000 in March to 2013, 270,000 rupiah per person per month. So it's not a lot of money, and it's roughly equivalent to the $1.25 line internationally. The vulnerable are those who are above the poverty line, but they're not yet secure. They've got a greater than 10% chance of falling below poverty, the poverty line next year, which is up to about 1.5 times the poverty line, about 400,000 rupiah per person per month, or around about $2 a month. There's a third group, which we're calling the emerging consumer class, or ECC. Now these are people who are above this vulnerability line, so they're secure from falling into poverty next year, but they're not above the point at which they're secure from falling into vulnerability next year. And this line stretches all the way up to nearly $1 million rupiah consumption per person per month, or around about $4.50. And then finally we have the consumer class, which are those who are secure, economically secure, who have a less than 10% chance of being in vulnerability next year. And so that's everyone above around about $1 million rupiah per month. And so these are the four different classes we're going to look at when we look at the economic function of different classes, and then later on when we start to look socioeconomically, we're going to look at these classes as well. And you'll notice we're not yet calling the consumer class middle class. What we're looking at is the economic function here, and so we're really just saying who's doing the consuming and who's driving economic growth. So how big are these different classes and how they evolved over time? Firstly, this is the consumption distribution in 2013. The group in blue are the poor, the group in red are the vulnerable, the group in orange are the emerging consumer class, or the ECC, and the group in green are the consumer class. And so in 2013, there was 28 million, or 11% poor, and over double that who are vulnerable, so another 27%. So roughly speaking, 40% of Indonesia is poor or vulnerable. This emerging consumer class is actually the largest group in Indonesia. So this is nearly half the population, 43%, are in this, they're secure from poverty but not yet secure from vulnerability. And the consumer class, although it spans a very wide consumption range, is 45 million, or 18% of Indonesia. And so sort of to put that in the context of those ranges we've seen from the other reports, it's around about in the middle of a bit of a similar order of magnitude to what a lot of people have been saying in terms of how big is the market size in Indonesia. How does that break down, the consumer class? Of that 45 million, the vast majority are at the bottom end of that range, so they're between $4.50 and $10. And there's almost no one who's above $20. It's 3% of that 45 million, or only 0.5% of the population. Right? Now, that seems pretty low, and it probably is. The Susamas estimates of higher incomes, those on more than $10 a day, which is equivalent to around about 2 million rupiah per month per person, there's only 8 million people, or around about 3% of the population. Those who are on more than $20 a day, or only 4 million rupiah a month, is only about 1 million people, which is 1/2 of 1% of the population. And a mere visual check outside in Jakarta and in a number of other cities in Indonesia tells you that this seems to be too low. One of the reasons for this is non-response in wealthy neighborhoods is a lot more common. So BPS goes to Menteng and they knock on the door to do the Susanas survey, and the guard says, "No, go away, please." And so what you're getting is a number of the richer Indonesians appear less frequently in the Susanas. And what we've done is we've looked at the non-response rate in different sampling units versus the average per capita expenditure in those sampling units, and it's monotonic and increasing. So that is, the richer your neighborhood gets, the more likely there is to be non-response by wealthier families. Another point to support this is if you look at the number of registered cars, private passenger cars, registered with the National Police, it's about twice the number of cars that are being reported in Susanas. So there's good reason to think that we're undercounting the top end. And so we're doing some work with the Fiscal Policy Office and Bank Indonesia to estimate how many are actually up this higher end, using both income tax data and using private credit information on things like mortgages and cars. So that work is not ready yet, but it's suffice to say, when we look at this number here, there's probably more than 45 million in this consumer class, and there are probably more of them who are up this upper end of the distribution. Nonetheless, what we'll do is we'll go and have a look about the people we do in the survey and say, how has this grown? So even though we haven't got all of the rich in here, the consumer class has been the fastest growing segment of the population by a long way. So it's grown at 11% every year over the last decade. And so it's more than doubled from 7% of the population in 2002 to the 18% that we're seeing now. So it's a rapidly growing group, even though we may be undercounting them. The emerging consumer class, as we see, is the largest group by a long way. It's growing more slowly as people graduate, enter into it by graduating out of poverty and vulnerability, but exit it by moving into the consumer class. And poverty and vulnerability has been falling pretty slowly in Indonesia. So it is fair to say that there is this relatively large and fast-growing consumer class in Indonesia, but a much larger beginning to consume class that's growing more slowly. And so if we think about market size, in some ways you can take a combination of these two groups, depending on the type of goods we're talking about. For basic consumer goods, you're talking about a very large market. For higher-end durables and so forth, it's more the consumer class here of 45 million. And I think in consumer terms, when people say the Indonesian market is 50 million or 100 million, I think it is okay to include the emerging consumer class. They may be economically insecure, so for you as an emerging consumer class, it's not great for you because you've got a good chance of falling back into vulnerability next year. But from a market perspective, there is this number of people. It's mostly an urban phenomenon. So about 3/4 of the consumer class live in urban areas, 1/4 of which is in Jabodetabek, Greater Jakarta, and a large majority of the rest of them are in Java. So Bandung and Surabaya and things like that. Although the actual rates of the consumer class, that's population driven, right? So the actual rates of the consumer class are higher in a number of other places, notably Bali, which is nearly as frequently, the percentage of the consumer class is nearly as high as in Jakarta. So what's been the role of the consumer class in terms of economic growth? So in terms of, this is nominal consumption out of Susanas. So the total consumption of the consumer class, and this is in trillions of nominal trillions of rupiah, has grown at 20% every year for the last decade, which is double that of the emerging consumer class and much higher than that for the poor and the vulnerable. Remember, this is in nominal terms. So what that means is, as a percentage of total household consumption, it's now nearly half of all household consumption comes from this ECC. So, sorry, from the consumer class. So there may be only 18% of the population, but they're half of household consumption. Poor and vulnerable are 40% of the population, but are not even 20% of the consumption. So the market size, if you like, if we think of consumer class and ECC as being this broader consumption base, is nearly 80% of all of the consumption, household consumption in Indonesia. So when we think about GDP, the real GDP growth rate over the last decade has averaged 5.7%, nearly 6% a year. Nearly half of that, 2.7 percentage points, comes from non-private consumption, right? So that's not households. Of the remainder, this is the households. 3 percentage points of the 5.7 comes from households, and over half of that is from the consumer class alone. So in total GDP terms, 1.6% of that GDP growth of the last decade, 1.6 of that 5.7 is from the consumer class alone. And if you're to think about the ECC in there as well, then that's almost half from those two groups themselves. So it has been a real component of economic growth in the last decade. This is also a conservative estimate, because we've been saying, the non-response of richer households means we're underestimating how many of them there actually are in there. And we haven't yet, we're doing some work to deflate the nominal consumption growth by prices. And in the last decade, the prices faced by the poor and vulnerable have been higher than the prices faced by richer households. So in real terms, they represent a greater component as well. So by the time we make both of these adjustments, this, which is about 28% of total growth, it might increase more to like 35 or even 40%. Okay, so, you know, one of the reasons we haven't called the consumer class middle class necessarily is we can ask the question, say, is the economically secure? Are they also socio-economically secure? And so if you look at non-monetary dimensions of poverty by these different classes, looking at access to clean water, access to sanitation, and access to proper housing, then on at least one dimension, half of the consumer class are poor. So they may be economically secure, they may have a low chance of falling into financial poverty or monetary poverty next year, but that doesn't mean they're socio-economically secure. And so if we think about these two terms, economically secure and socio-economically secure, then breaking up the consumer class, you get about half of them who are economically secure but still monetary poor on one dimension, and about half of them who are socio-economically secure. And then there's that small group of the consumer class at the top who are on more than 5 million per month. And so when we go through, Ikuko's now going to go through the different socioeconomic behaviors of these different classes. And so we're going to break up the consumer class into those who are the ES, economically secure, and the SES, who are socio-economically secure, as well as showing the very small group of the wealthiest Indonesians that we see in the survey data.
Okay, thank you much. So using the socio-economic definition of consumer class, just Matthew introduced to us, I'd like to talk about the characteristics and behavior that differentiate Indonesian consumer class from other classes. So the first section is about the education and the employment profile of consumer class. So let's look at this slide. This slide shows the average years of schooling of household head and spouse. So let's look at poor and vulnerable first. On average, poor and vulnerable just completed primary school only. And moving to ECC, they complete. And the consumer class, both types of consumer class almost finished high school. And then even moving to richer class, riches of consumer class are getting even better on average. So how about the working sector of household head? And first look at this blue bar. This different. It's better. It's on. Okay. This represents agricultural sector, and the blue range gradually decrease, moving to consumer class. And then consumer class for less likely to work in the agricultural sector now, and the more likely to work in the value-added sector, such as manufacturing, trade, public and government, finance, and education. And let's look at occupational status of household head. The result shown here is basically consistent with what we saw in the previous slide. In the previous slide, we saw many consumer class now working in non-agricultural sector, and then now a consumer class are less likely to be self-employed farmers and more likely to be regular salary employees. Now, as you can see, more than 50% of consumer class are working as worker or employee here. Next section is about the consumption behavior of consumer class. The first slide is about the consumption composition by class. And then now let's look at the blue bar here. This represents the food consumption percentage. And then as you can see, poor and vulnerable are spending almost 2/3 of consumption on only food. Moving to wealthier class, actually consumer class spend now less than 50% on food, and the richest household use only 20% of consumption on food. Then consumer class and the wealthier household are beginning to use their money on durables and entertainment. So from the next slide, let's look at the asset ownership by each class. The first slide is about home amenities, and then if we look at the refrigerator, around 60 to 80% of consumer class has refrigerator at home. But if we if we look at, say, up to ECC, almost nobody owned, say, at home. And then only household above consumer class started on, say. And we can see the similar pattern in other home amenities such as gas container, water heater, bottled water, and then large size of electricity usage. And next one is about the technology and information. So we can see similar patterns here. Household above consumer class are more likely to use more sophisticated technology and IT service, such as cable TV, computer, and then consumer class have more access to internet by using cell phone. And okay, and then let's look at the vehicle ownership. First, motorcycle, and then even for poor and vulnerable, 40 or 60% of poor and vulnerable have already owned a motorcycle at home. But if you look at the car, actually only above consumer class, we can see meaningful non-zero numbers in this chart. So this implies consumer class are starting to switch from motorcycle to cars. So in the next section, I'd like to talk about the socio-economic aspect of consumer class a bit. The first side is access to clean water, proper sanitation, and quality housing. Overall, these categories still remain a problem for all classes other than socio-economically secure consumer class. Especially quality housing seems the biggest problem, and then this mostly prevents this economically secure consumption class from being socio-economically secured. And the next slide is about the access to proper transportation and the infrastructure. This analysis is conducted by using district level data set. So we examine whether households have access to proper infrastructure or transportation in the same district. And as a result, basically transportation and infrastructure are accessible across all classes. So how about the access to education facilities? Yeah, we can see similar results. And then actually in almost all categories, more than 80% of households from all classes have access to proper education facilities. Then this is access to healthcare service. Yes, here as well, actually other than secondary access to secondary care, I think more than 90% of households from all classes have access to proper healthy facility, proper healthcare facility. So overall, we said all class households have reasonable access to education and healthcare facilities, but quality issues of healthcare and education are big different problems. So we will look at some quality aspect of healthcare and education later in the presentation.
Thanks, Ikuko. So I think this point about quality in education, variation of quality in education and healthcare is a really important point. So in some of the other work we're doing on inequality, I should have said at the start that this middle class work is one of 6 different background papers we're doing from a much larger major inequality report to come later this year. And one of the other issues we're looking at is inequality of opportunity. And in that, this quality dimension is really important. We've just begun to do some work in collaboration with education colleagues to look at whether or not we can get a better angle of particularly educational quality and how that might be distributed over the different classes. Because coming up to primary school or to high school, even if you're poor and vulnerable, the school's going to be there, but is the teacher going to be there? And so that type of information we're working on to improve. The last dimension that we're going to look at in terms of socioeconomic needs is on social security. So when you look at pensions, almost no one in Indonesia has a pension, and this includes the socioeconomically secure. Now, of course, SJSN and BPJS Dua is designed to address this in part, and the goal is universal coverage by 2019. And then the same for health insurance. Health insurance coverage is a lot larger. And so what you've got is relatively high levels amongst the poor and vulnerable, which is driven by Jamkesmas, the healthy waiver program from the government. So that covers 40% of Indonesia. And that's non-contributory. The poor are having their contributions paid for them by the government. And then you're seeing health insurance, which is coming through work or private purchasing amongst the wealthier households. So what are the implications of these coverage levels and SJN and the goal of universal coverage? And I think this is a really important policy area when we think about going forward. So firstly, what we know is civil servants and richer households are going to have access to health and employment and retirement insurance and savings. The government's going to cover health insurance for the poor and the vulnerable, but you're going to have this middle, which is sort of this ECC and even some of the economically secure consumer class, where they're less than 50% covered now, and it's hard to see how they're going to be much more than that covered by 2019 or in the near future. And one of the reasons for this is how many of these are still working in the informal sector. So we saw the ECC formality levels were about 50%, and for the consumer class it was about 58% when you're looking at being a worker or employee. A number of others are self-employed, or they may have their own business with a worker. But collecting contributions from the informal sector has been a challenge all over the world for social security schemes. And particularly the pension law says there won't be coverage for those who aren't making contributions. So one of the big challenges in Indonesia, if it wants to achieve universal coverage in healthcare and particularly pensions, is going to be thinking about how do you collect contributions from people who are in the informal sector. So, this could be a mixture of incentives for people to participate and sanctions, penalties for not participating. But I think without looking at that, what we'll start to see is the poor are going to get their contributions paid for by the government, the wealthy will be paying themselves, or through the formal sector it'll be being withheld, and you might get some sort of a U-shaped distribution going forward. And so this is a key policy challenge, I think. Okay, so now let's think about the third function that the middle class has supposedly played in other countries, which is the role in influencing policy and public service delivery. Now, I'll start off by saying this work is ongoing, and what you're doing is getting a sneak preview, and unfortunately I won't answer the really interesting questions such as, can they influence, who could play a role in influencing, for example, clean governance. We can start to give you some information on who might play a role in influencing the quality of public service delivery, such as education and health, or housing and water and sanitation. So, on transportation, basically no one's using public transportation. Everyone goes straight from to private vehicles. So here we're looking at transportation to work by the different classes. So blue is walking, and as you get richer, you stop walking and you start going by motorcycle, which is in the green. And then when you can afford it, you start going by car, especially in Jakarta, which is the teal. And the public transport, which is the purple slice, never really reaches much of a critical attitude. Now, how much of this is demand and how much is the supply, right? How much are people not using public transportation because there isn't really any effective public transportation, or how much do people not want to use it is an issue we need to look into further. And you see a similar pattern for transportation to school. What about healthcare? Well, what we're seeing here is a movement to, as you get wealthier, to higher quality and often private healthcare. So if you look at the poor, when we're looking at outpatient treatment, the main interests here are the dark blue is a state hospital, the red is a private hospital, the green is a doctor, and the purple is a puskesmas. So when you're poorer, you tend to go to a puskesmas a lot of the time. Then as you get wealthier, you increasingly start to go to a doctor, or even to private and public hospitals for outpatient treatment. Now, obviously private hospitals are private treatment. With the doctors and medical workers, it's a little difficult to say because they're sort of public in the morning and private in the afternoon with their own practices. But it's clearly a trend towards higher quality of care, or at least perceived higher quality of care on outpatient services. And when we look at inpatient, you see the same pattern. So mostly people are going to public hospitals, and as they get wealthier and can afford it, they move to using private hospitals instead. And you'll see a similar pattern on birth assistance. Now, why is this concerning? If you're opting out of the public system and going into the private system when you can afford to pay for it, then you really don't care too much about the quality of the of the health care that's being received through the public system. And so, you know, the wealthier, perhaps the most educated, the most likely to voice complaints or discontent with the quality of public service are the ones who are not going to because they're moving out of the system. It also means they're going to be less supportive of additional money to go into healthcare, into public healthcare, which health spending in Indonesia is quite low compared to other countries. So you sort of lose this social contract if the wealthier are moving out or opting out of public services. When we look at education, the consumer classes are having less children. So you see for the poor and vulnerable, on average, they've got 2 children. And then by the time you get to the consumer classes, then they've only got about 1 child on average. And so you see a falling dependency ratio for those particular classes. They're having fewer children, but they're investing more in their education. So they're more likely to go to start school early, to go to preschool. So you see higher rates of preschool enrollment amongst the preschool-aged children. And they're more likely to stay in school longer. So at a primary school level, those aged 7 to 12, everyone's pretty much going to be enrolled in primary school. But as you move on to junior high, and then in particular SMR and tertiary levels, you see a real decrease in enrollment rates, a lot of dropout amongst the poor and vulnerable, whereas amongst these consumer classes here, it's a lot higher. And by the time you're at tertiary, it's pretty much only the consumer classes who are likely to be in school at all. And then, as we see in private care, we're starting to see some opting out of public education as well. So here we're looking at primary school. The blue is public schools, and the thing that we're particularly interested in are exclusive private schools, which are in the purple. Now, by exclusive private schools, what we've done is had a look at the tuition, the fees being paid by each of the households, and we said those who are in private schools, we're paying the high end of the tuition. We're calling that exclusive private schools compared to other private schools, because there are a lot of other private schools of different quality and fee structure throughout Indonesia. And so, as you can see, at a primary school level, you see almost no private schooling until you move into the consumer classes, where it starts to appear. It's still dominated by public schooling, but you're beginning to see an opting out and into a private schooling at the primary level, and this is a stronger pattern once you get to SMP. At SDA, there's still a lot of public schools around, and there's still a lot of quality public schools around. At SMP, you see this opting out is becoming larger once you get to SMP and SMR levels. And so it's not the same opting out you're seeing in the health sense, not to the same degree, but you're beginning to see this trend. Okay, so wrapping up, what we're seeing is there's been strong economic growth, obviously, in the last decade, and a lot of this has been driven by this rapidly growing consumer class. But we do think it's important. We wouldn't call the reason why we sort of wanted to say that there's an emerging consumer class as well as a consumer class is there's differences between the consumer class and the ECC. In some ways, I think the consumer class is very aspirational. So firstly, they're economically secure from poverty, and the ECC are not. And so it's important to distinguish them on that basis. But they also are starting to display different behaviors. You saw when Ikuko went through, a lot of the titles of each of the slides were the consumer classes are starting to buy ACs. They're starting to buy cars. And they're starting to spend on consumer goods and durables. So in a lot of ways, there's a sort of, not everyone's doing it, but when you can afford to, it's an aspirational thing to say we want these higher quality things. They're starting to demand higher quality health and education services, and if they can't get that in the public areas, they'll go to the private sector. But from a socioeconomic or from a policy perspective, only half of that consumer class are also free from non-monetary poverty. So even though only 18% of Indonesians are economically secure, we're saying even half of that, so 9% of Indonesians are socioeconomically secure. And then finally, look, it may be that it's the emerging consumer class, rather than the middle class, the consumer class, who might provide the strongest voice for public service quality improvements. So we're seeing the consumer class are increasingly opting out of private sector, public sector health and education services, as well as public transportation and utilities. A lot of people are starting to live in Kota Mandiri, things like BSD City and things like that, which are these large apartment and housing complexes that have their own sewage treatment. They have their own clean water. They have their own generators. So I'm sure they were sleeping well last night when Thailand was blacking out the rest of Jakarta. So to this extent that they're starting to use private sector services, they're not going to be a voice necessarily for improving the quality of public. So there are lots of good quality, high quality SMR schools. And so if I'm a wealthier Indonesian and I live near a good SMR, I send my kids there. And we see that, right? Even at the SMR level, it's still something like 75% are going to public school. But if I don't have a high quality SMR near me, rather than be an advocate for change on that, I just send them to a private school. So in the areas of the public service where you need it most, this is where we're starting to see the consumer class go into the private sector. The emerging consumer class can't really afford to pay for private services. And they're very large, they're the largest segment of the population at 43%, or 107 million. So we're doing more work on this, but it's possible that what you'll see is the voice for change with respect to quality of public service delivery might be more the ECC than the consumer class. And so, overall what you might see is there's no single group that we would call the middle class. If we think about in the West, this economic function, this socioeconomic function, and this policy influence function were played historically by the same group of people. The economic and the socioeconomic, you may see the same similar patterns to the West in terms of the consumer class, but on this policy influence side, it could be this much larger but unable to opt out group of the ECC who are starting to play that role. Okay, so the next steps that we're doing, we're going to use some survey data on attitudes and opinions to sort of see how that might vary by the different classes. More importantly, we're going to dig more into this political function that the different classes might be playing. So for this question of will it be the ECC or the consumer class who are more vocal and influential, one of the things we're going to look at it is at a district level over time, does it appear to be the size of the ECC or the consumer class who have been driving, influencing health spending and education spending at a district level? And so forth. So there'll be more that we want to do on that role. So we'll turn it over to the discussion. I'll let Martia facilitate this. Some of the things we're interested in is how do you feel about this vulnerability definition we've used, and what do you think of these distinctions in the different functions that different classes can play, and what do you think is missing so far from the analysis?
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for a very interesting presentation and for keeping the time. Perfect timing. So we'll open immediately the space for discussion from the floor. And please identify yourself before raising questions. Welcome.
Hi, I can speak loud enough. I'm Jeff Sinet from RTI International. Very interesting. I don't know issues at all. I think it's a great definition. I find it very interesting the inclusion of the socioeconomic vulnerability. I'd love to see a lot more of that once you publish this to have a better, be able to articulate what I might think about them. It's a bit strange. I would think that that might actually, it's curious to see it not captured in vulnerability. So I'm not sure that I saw how you included that in this vulnerability to 10%. Second point, is about the 10%. Why did you choose 10%? Because it seems quite low. If you have just 10% chance of falling back into vulnerability or back into poverty, you know, your behavior might be one thing. If you have a 50% chance of falling into it, your behavior might be quite different. So curious to hear your thoughts on that. But from an analytic perspective, you know, this is just fine. The point I wanted to sort of put out for other people to ask is this concept of who influences policy and public services, and how that happens. There are different ways it happens, I think. And there is that voice of, you know, empowered people that, you know, go to the health center and say this is not good, or go to the principal of the school and say the teachers aren't there and we demand that they be there. Another way is through something that everybody, most people in this room are probably going to be doing in about a month and a half or so, and that is voting. There's a very interesting article written, and I don't remember the name of the author, by an Australian, on sort of tracing the political history of national health insurance. In fact, they're purporting that actually it was the poor that had the biggest influence on this stream over the course of more than 10 years that eventually led to this universal health insurance, at least on paper, the coverage. And why? Because politicians were seeking votes, and the biggest voting bloc is the poor and the non-poor, 50% of the population. They were putting programs into place, John Vista, all over the place. They were not responding to the middle class, the emerging middle class, the wealthy even. They were responding to where they need to go to get the votes. And I think, you know, I'd like to hear your perspective on that as well. And, you know, finally, if you've got only 18% in that middle class, and it's only increasing at about 1 percentage point a year, which is what your data shows, it's going to take a long time before they have numbers enough to see an abandonment enough of public services for the remaining Indonesians who use those services to make a difference, whether they protest or don't protest, whether they vacate and abandon the services or not, almost seems not to matter, because you still have 3/4 of the people still using those services. Health, not so much, it's more like 50%. And sorry, one more thing. Does it matter? Who cares if they abandon the public sector? Who cares if the public sector withers away to nothing in terms of health care? You don't need the public sector for health care services as long as you have a well-functioning, well-financed insurance system so that people get the care that they want. In fact, if that's what they want, perhaps the government shouldn't be providing those kinds of curative health services on the scale that they do now. They don't do it very effectively anyway. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Matt, would you like to go through?
Yeah, sure. So on the vulnerability and the socially economically secure, yeah, I mean, we could look at the presentation. We could change that first part. That's not in that vulnerability definition. That vulnerability definition is strictly monetary poverty, right? And so we could say that, you know, it could be vulnerability to monetary poverty is the way of thinking about it. And the reason why it doesn't include the non-monetary dimensions is it's in the economic section. So if I have clean water or not, if I have good quality housing, it's not going to stop me from necessarily going out and buying a phone in Indonesia. So from a market perspective or an economic perspective, it's vulnerability to falling into monetary poverty and therefore losing income and stop consuming. That's what people are interested in when we're looking at that function. But we wanted to, when we moved to the section, we're saying, talking about socioeconomic behavior and development and policy needs, then clearly you do care about whether or not these people who are safe from poverty also have access to these non-monetary welfare dimensions. So that's why it's not in there. We've done quite a bit of work on multidimensional poverty in other areas. We've looked at child multidimensional poverty and things like that. So it's an area that we've done work on elsewhere and are doing inequality in terms of access to opportunities elsewhere as well. So more on that will come out. Why 10%? So when you first said that, I thought you were going to say it was too low. And you're saying, well, someone who's got a 50% chance of falling into poverty might act differently than someone who has a 10. I think there's a lot of people who say 10% means 1 in 10 of these guys are going to be poor next year, so maybe it should be 5% or 1%. It's arbitrary, right? We're taking sort of the vulnerability definition and we're just sort of arbitrarily saying 10%. I think it seems to be a relatively reasonable benchmark. I'm not sure it's true that at a higher percentage it changes your behavior, because you don't know when you're at, say, 300,000 repair instead of 400,000 repair that your chances have gone from 50 to 10. Right? That's just sort of what the data are revealing. And I think a lot of people who are in these poor and vulnerable, and even in the ECC group, they're all sort of, in some ways, have probably similar attitudes towards risk management, similar access to a lot of those options. Who influences policy? I mean, I think you're right when you look at the national health insurance and how that's involved in Indonesia. But 10 years ago, that size of the poor and vulnerable was half or more of the country. Now it's just come down to under 40%, and that's going to continue to fall, albeit slowly. And they're already, the ECC is a larger group. So I do think the poor and the vulnerable are going to matter in a vote-attracting democracy. But I think the ECC is starting to be a larger group and potentially a more vocal group, especially with more income. But no, this is a good question. We need to trace this a lot more to answer this question of who's going to influence policy. But it seems to me that it might not be the consumer class as much. I'll stop and we can come back to a lot of those other questions. But because we've got a decent amount of time, but I don't. I'm going to have to leave.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Matt. Please, next question.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Fajar from European Union delegation. First of all, it's very appreciated to provide us with what we call more advanced categorization of the middle class compared to the previous categorization and definition. My first comment is about that what my impression is that you're talking about the consumer class and emerging consumer class, and one of the main trend is about the transportation, where they have tendency to move from, for example, motorcycle to cars. I think what come up to my mind is that they are subsidized emerging consumer class and consumer class because of the fuel subsidies. So lower price of fuel increase their responsible income, which they could afford to consume well from tertiary, from basic, then until tertiary needs, as you provide in a consumption composition. Yeah. Well, this is maybe because I'm not what we call good in research and theory. Maybe this is explain why the poor is remain poor, the vulnerable poor have a high risk to fall to poor, and why the inequality in Indonesia increasing, Gini ratio, for example.
Right. So
yeah.
I don't think that the fuel subsidy is much of a deterrent of moving from motorcycles to cars.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you can afford a car, you'll grumble about higher fuel prices. This is what happens in the West, but you don't necessarily stop driving. I think the issue is, I think there is a real lack of public transport infrastructure, particularly in Jakarta, and you're going to take the car until there's a reasonable alternative. And I think once you start to see things like the MRT and so forth in there, people will move a bit away from cars because the traffic is so bad. In terms of the inequality, so we've done some other work which we've presented elsewhere on the who benefits from different public spending, health, education, and the subsidies and social assistance, and who's paying different taxes, such as income tax, sales tax, tobacco excise, and so forth. And interestingly, when you look at fuel subsidies, even though in absolute terms a lot more goes to the rich, in relative terms, relative to their market income, it's about the same. So even though I get very little as a poor household, because I have a very low income,
yeah,
it's worth about 9% of my income. And that's actually higher than it is for the richest. So from a Gini perspective, it's actually neutral. It doesn't make the Gini, just because of the way the Gini is constructed. I think the way to think about it is the opportunity cost. If you look at the social assistance, things like the cash transfer system, PKH, or BSM scholarships, things like Ruskin and Joe Kesmas, if you look at what they do to the Gini, they, for the money spent on them, they move the genie down the most. So social assistance is the most effective at improving inequality, but it's the thing we spend the least on. Much less than the region and much less than the world. So it's not the fuel subsidies make inequality go up. It's what you could be using that money on to benefit the poor and the middle. That could make it go down, and I think that's a really fair point. And hopefully, under a new administration, we'll see continued fuel subsidy reform over time. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave that there and go to the meeting, but I will leave you in Ikuko and Matia's capable hands, and there's plenty more time for discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you.